In the harsh winter of 1867, Martha Whitmore, a widow, finds herself struggling to protect her young son, Benjamin, from the brutality of their isolated existence on the Kansas frontier. With winter closing in and their supplies dwindling, they are haunted by the traumas of their past and the oppressive presence of Martha's abusive brother-in-law, Joshua. Their life takes an unexpected turn when a mysterious Comanche hunter named Kiona appears from the prairie mist, offering them food and shelter. Initially, Martha is filled with suspicion and fear, conditioned by years of conflict between settlers and Native Americans. However, as she reluctantly accepts Kiona's help, she begins to see the man behind the warrior facade. Kiona shares stories of his own loss, drawing parallels between their lives. As they work together to survive the relentless winter, Martha and Benjamin learn invaluable lessons about trust, compassion, and the true meaning of family. The tension escalates when Joshua discovers their alliance with Kiona, leading to a confrontation that forces Martha to choose between her past and the possibility of a new future. In the end, the trio must unite against the harsh elements and their own prejudices to forge a bond stronger than blood. "Please stop," she cried, bursting through the door into the August heat of 1867. The sun blazed overhead like an angry eye, turning the dust beneath their feet into fine powder that stuck to everything. "He's just a boy." Joshua Whitmore stood 6 feet tall with arms thick as fence posts from years of breaking horses. His beard dripped with sweat and tobacco juice as he sneered at Martha. "This boy stole money from my wife's dresser. $20, gone. I never took nothing," Benjamin sobbed, his small hands pressed against the barn wall where Joshua had cornered him. Red welts crisscrossed his thin shoulders, and dirt mixed with tears on his cheeks. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. Since her husband Robert died building their dream home on this land, Joshua had grown bolder with his cruelty. Eleanor, Joshua's wife and Robert's sister, watched from the porch with cold satisfaction glittering in her pale eyes. "The money was Robert's," Martha said, her voice shaking but determined. "I gave Ben $2 to buy supplies in town yesterday." Joshua's massive hand grabbed Martha's wrist, squeezing until she gasped. "Robert's dead, woman. Dead men don't own property. Dead men don't have wives who give orders." His breath reeked of whiskey and rage. "You live in my house now. You eat my food. That makes you mine." The words hit Martha like physical blows. For 8 months since the fever took Robert, she had endured Joshua's increasingly bold advances and Eleanor's poisonous whispers. But seeing her son's blood on Joshua's whip awakened something fierce and protective inside her chest. "Let go of me," she whispered. Joshua laughed, a sound like grinding rocks. "Or what? You'll run away? Where would you go, Martha? A woman alone with a worthless boy." He squeezed her wrist harder. "The prairie eats people like you for breakfast." Benjamin struggled to his feet, his young face twisted with pain and fury. "Don't touch my mama." The boy grabbed a stick from the ground and swung it at Joshua's legs. The stick snapped like a twig against the man's thick boots, but the gesture of defiance made Joshua's eyes narrow with dangerous intent. "So the little thief wants to fight now?" Joshua dropped Martha's wrist and advanced on Benjamin. "Maybe you need to learn respect the hard way." Martha threw herself between them, her arms spread wide. "No, you've hurt him enough. I've barely started." Joshua's voice dropped to a growl. "By the time I'm finished with him, he'll know his place. And so will you." Eleanor's voice drifted from the porch like poison honey. "Joshua, dear, perhaps you should lock them in the root cellar tonight. Let them think about their sins in the dark." The root cellar. Martha's stomach turned cold. The small, airless space beneath the house crawled with spiders and reeked of rotting vegetables. Last time Joshua had locked Benjamin down there, the boy had nightmares for weeks. "Please," Martha begged, hating how small and desperate she sounded. "We'll leave. We won't cause any more trouble." "Leave?" Eleanor laughed from her chair. "With what money? What wagon? What food?" She rose and walked closer, her blue dress rustling like snake scales. "You have nothing, Martha. You are nothing. The only reason you're not begging in the streets is our Christian charity. Benjamin wiped blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. Despite his pain, his dark eyes blazed with the same stubborn fire that had made his father carve a farm from raw prairie. We don't need your charity. Brave words from a boy who can't even protect his mother, Joshua sneered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, letting them fall into the dust at Benjamin's feet. There's your precious money, boy. Pick it up. Benjamin stared at the coins glinting in the dirt. Martha could see the war happening inside him, the desperate need for those few dollars fighting against his wounded pride. Pick it up, Joshua repeated, his voice deadly quiet. On your knees, like the beggar you are. The silence stretched taut as rope. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the distance, its sweet song at odds with the ugly scene unfolding in the farmyard. Benjamin's hands clenched into small fists. No, he whispered. Joshua's face turned red as fresh blood. What did you say? I said no. Benjamin's voice grew stronger. I won't beg from you anymore. Martha felt pride and terror war in her chest. Her son was learning to stand up for himself, but Joshua looked ready to kill. You insolent little... Joshua raised his hand to strike. Stop! Martha stepped forward, her decision crystallizing like ice. We'll go. Tonight. Just give us until morning to pack our things. Eleanor clapped her hands together with false delight. How wonderful! Finally, some sense from the widow. Joshua studied Martha's face with calculating eyes. Where will you go? That's not your concern. Everything on this land is my concern. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. You could stay, Martha. I'd treat you real good if you learned to be grateful. Martha's skin crawled at the hunger in his eyes. Never. Then you'd better pray the prairie wolves don't catch your scent. Joshua turned and walked toward the house. Eleanor, give her some flour and salt pork. Enough for 3 days. Christian charity. 3 days. Martha's voice cracked. That's not enough to. It's more than you deserve, Eleanor snapped. Be grateful we're not sending you away empty-handed. As the couple disappeared into the house, Martha knelt beside Benjamin and gently touched his wounded shoulders. The boy flinched but didn't pull away. Does it hurt much? She asked softly. I'm fine, Mama. But his voice shook, betraying the lie. Martha looked around the farmyard where she had spent the happiest years of her life. Robert's workshop still held his tools. The vegetable garden she had planted showed the first green shoots of late summer harvest. The little cabin they had built together represented everything they had dreamed of creating. Now it would all belong to Joshua and Eleanor. Where will we go? Benjamin asked, echoing Joshua's earlier question. Martha stood and brushed dirt from her worn dress. She had no answer that wouldn't terrify them both. 27 years old, with $17 to her name and winter approaching like a hungry wolf. We'll figure it out, she said, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Benjamin nodded and began picking up the scattered coins. Martha watched him move carefully, his small back rigid with pain and pride, and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, wherever they went, she would find a way to keep her son safe. She just hoped the prairie would give them enough time to learn how. The wagon wheels squeaked like dying mice as Martha guided their borrowed mule down the rutted dirt road leading away from the only home Benjamin had ever known. Dawn painted the Kansas sky the color of fresh blood, and meadowlarks called from fence posts like they were saying goodbye. Benjamin sat beside her on the wagon seat, his thin shoulders wrapped in Robert's old coat. The welts on his back had scabbed over during the night, but Martha could see him wince with every bump in the road. In the wagon bed behind them lay everything they owned. 2 blankets, a cast-iron pot, a bag of flour, some salt pork, and 17 silver dollars sewn into the lining of Martha's spare dress. Mama, look, Benjamin whispered, pointing back toward the farm. Martha turned to see Joshua standing in the doorway of their former home, his massive frame blocking out the morning light. Even at this distance, she could feel his eyes on her like cold fingers against her neck. Eleanor appeared beside him, her pale hand raised in a mocking wave. Don't look back, Martha told Benjamin, facing forward again. That's not our home anymore. Where is our home? The question hung in the air between them like dust motes. Martha had no answer. Lawrence lay 20 miles to the east, but she had no friends there who would take in a widow and her son. Council Grove was closer, but the few people she knew from church would ask too many questions about the bruises on Benjamin's back. I don't know yet, she admitted, but we'll find one. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, turning the morning cool into blazing heat. Martha's hands grew slick with sweat on the reins, and she could see Benjamin's face growing red beneath his father's old hat. The mule plodded along at its own pace, stopping frequently to crop grass from the roadside. By noon, they had covered only 8 miles. Mama, I'm thirsty, Benjamin said, his lips already cracking from the dry air. Martha pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small creek that crossed under the road. The water ran shallow and warm, but it was clean enough to drink. They sat in the shade of the wagon while the mule drank its fill. Tell me about Papa again, Benjamin said, splashing creek water on his face. Martha smiled despite their circumstances. What do you want to know? Tell me about how he built our house. Our house. Martha's heart clenched at the words, but she kept her voice steady. Your father cut every log himself. He said he wanted to build something that would last forever, something strong enough to protect his family through any storm. But it didn't protect us from Uncle Joshua. The simple truth of it hit Martha like a physical blow. Robert's strong hands, his careful planning, his dreams of creating a safe haven for his family, none of it had mattered once he was gone. Some storms come from inside, honey. Papa couldn't have planned for that. Benjamin nodded solemnly, his young mind working through concepts too big for his 10 years. Are we gonna build another house? Someday, when we find the right place. Will it be as strong as Papa's? Martha looked at her son's earnest face, seeing Robert's determination in the set of his jaw. Stronger, she promised. They climbed back onto the wagon and continued east. The road grew rougher as they left settled farmland behind, winding through tall prairie grass that whispered secrets to the wind. Martha had never traveled this far from home alone, and the vastness of the landscape made her feel small and exposed. Late in the afternoon, they met their first travelers going the opposite direction. A family in a covered wagon pulled by 2 oxen stopped to water their animals at the same creek where Martha and Benjamin had rested earlier. Afternoon, called the man driving the wagon. He looked to be about Martha's age, with kind eyes and work-hardened hands. You folks traveling far? Looking for work, Martha replied carefully. Know of any towns ahead that might need a seamstress? The man's wife leaned out from the wagon cover. She was younger than Martha, with a baby in her arms and worry lines around her eyes. You traveling alone with just the boy? We're managing fine, Martha said, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. It's just. The woman glanced at her husband. We passed through Lawrence yesterday. There's talk of Indian troubles south of here. Comanche raiding parties moving up from the territories. Martha's blood turned cold. She had heard the stories. Entire families found scalped and burned, livestock stolen, homesteads left as smoking ruins. But those were tales from the wild territories far to the south, not civilized Kansas. How far south? She asked, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Hard to say, the man replied. Army patrol told us to stick to the main roads and travel in groups if possible. He looked at Martha's small wagon and single mule with obvious concern. You might want to turn back, ma'am. Find somewhere safe to winter. After the family continued on their way, Martha sat frozen on the wagon seat. Benjamin had heard every word, and she could see the fear creeping into his dark eyes. Are the Indians gonna scalp us, Mama? No, honey. We're going to be careful and smart, and nothing bad is going to happen. But as they continued down the lonely road, Martha's eyes began scanning the horizon for signs of movement. Every shadow in the tall grass made her heart race. Every bird call sounded like a war cry to her frightened imagination. The sun was setting when they finally reached the outskirts of Lawrence. The town sprawled along the Kansas River like a collection of wooden boxes, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys to merge with the evening sky. Martha had visited Lawrence only twice before, both times with Robert to sell crops and buy supplies. Now she was here alone, with $17 and nowhere to sleep. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Peterson. The room cost 50 cents for the night, a fortune Martha could barely afford, but it had a real bed and a wash basin, luxuries that felt like heaven after the long day on the road. "You planning to stay in Lawrence?" Mrs. Peterson asked as she led them upstairs. "Looking for work," Martha replied. "Might find washing to do at the hotel, or mending at the general store." The woman's sharp eyes took in Benjamin's thin frame and Martha's worn dress. "Though winter's coming on fast. Might be smart to find family to take you in." That night, as Benjamin slept fitfully beside her in the narrow bed, Martha stared at the ceiling and tried to plan their next move. $17 wouldn't last long, especially with winter approaching. She needed steady work, but most employers wouldn't hire a woman with a child to care for. Outside the window, Lawrence settled into sleep around them. But Martha lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town and wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Joshua's cruel words echoed in her mind. "The prairie eats people like you for breakfast." Maybe he was right. Maybe she and Benjamin were too small, too weak, too unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. But as she watched her son sleep, his face peaceful despite everything they had endured, Martha felt her resolve harden like cooling steel. They had survived Joshua's brutality. They had escaped with their dignity intact. They would find a way to survive whatever came next. She just hoped it would be enough. Martha's fingers were bleeding again, but she couldn't stop scrubbing the filthy sheets that piled higher around her like dirty snow. The hotel laundry room in Lawrence steamed like a cooking pot, and sweat dripped from her forehead into the wash basin as she worked through her third week of dawn-to-dusk labor. "Faster, Mrs. Whitmore," barked Mr. Henley, the hotel owner, as he dumped another armload of soiled linens onto her work table. "The guests in room 12 are complaining about their bed sheets." Again. Martha nodded without looking up, her back screaming from bending over the washtub for 10 hours straight. The job paid 30 cents a day, barely enough to cover their room and one meal between her and Benjamin. She had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. Benjamin sat in the corner of the laundry room, quietly mending torn pillowcases with thread Martha had taught him to use. At 10 years old, his small fingers moved with surprising skill, but Martha hated seeing him spend his days in the hot, humid room instead of playing outside like other children. "Mama," he whispered when Mr. Henley left. "My stomach hurts." Martha's heart clenched. They had eaten only bread and thin soup for 3 days running. The boy was growing thinner by the week, his clothes hanging loose on his small frame. "I know, sweetheart. Tonight we'll have meat with our supper." The lie came easily now, but each one felt like swallowing glass. Through the small window, Martha could see October frost painting the grass silver. Winter was racing toward them like a runaway horse, and she had saved only $3 beyond their daily needs. At this rate, they would be sleeping on the street before Thanksgiving. A commotion in the hotel lobby made her look up from the wash basin. Raised voices, heavy boots on wooden floors, and then Mr. Henley's nervous laughter echoing through the building. "Benjamin, stay here," Martha said, wiping her hands on her apron. She crept to the laundry room door and peered down the hallway toward the lobby. 3 men stood near the front desk, their trail clothes dusty and their faces hard as stone. The tallest one wore a star-shaped badge that caught the lamplight, a sheriff from some distant county. Martha's blood turned cold as she recognized the massive frame and tobacco-stained beard of the second man. Joshua Whitmore had found them. "She's here, all right," Joshua was saying to the sheriff. "Saw her through the window, washing clothes like the common servant she's become." His voice carried the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. The sheriff adjusted his gun belt and nodded. "What exactly are you claiming she stole from you?" $50 in silver coins, Joshua replied smoothly. "Family money that belonged to my late brother." She took it when she ran off with the boy. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. $50. She had never seen that much money at one time in her entire life. But she knew Joshua well enough to understand his plan. Accuse her of theft, have her arrested, and claim custody of Benjamin while she rotted in jail. And the boy, my nephew. Poor child's been corrupted by his mother's criminal ways. But blood is blood. My wife and I will raise him proper. Mr. Henley's voice quavered as he spoke. I don't know anything about stolen money, Sheriff. Mrs. Whitmore's been working here 3 weeks. Honest as the day is long. We'll let a judge decide that, the sheriff replied. Where is she? Martha's mind raced. The laundry room had no other exit, and Benjamin was trapped inside with her. In moments, Joshua would have them both. She thought of her son's thin face, his trusting eyes, his brave attempt to protect her from Joshua's whip. She would die before letting that monster get his hands on Benjamin again. Moving as quietly as a cat, Martha slipped back into the laundry room. Benjamin looked up from his mending, and she could see he knew something was terribly wrong. We have to go, she whispered urgently. Right now. What's happening? Uncle Joshua found us. The words made Benjamin's face go white with fear. There's a window in the storage closet. We can climb out the back. Heavy footsteps approached down the hallway. Martha grabbed their few possessions, Benjamin's father's compass, their remaining money, and Robert's old coat, and pushed her son toward the narrow storage closet. Mrs. Whitmore, the sheriff's voice boomed through the laundry room door. Open up in the name of the law. The storage closet window was small and high, barely large enough for an adult to squeeze through. Martha boosted Benjamin up first, watching him wiggle through the opening and drop to the alley behind the hotel. I'm coming in, the sheriff called. Martha hauled herself up to the window just as the laundry room door crashed open. She squeezed through the narrow opening, feeling splinters tear at her dress, and tumbled into the alley beside Benjamin. Run, she gasped, pulling him to his feet. They fled through the maze of back alleys between Lawrence's buildings, their feet splashing through puddles of dirty water and stumbling over scattered garbage. Behind them, shouts erupted from the hotel as Joshua and the sheriff discovered their escape. There, behind the blacksmith shop, Joshua's voice carried over the rooftops like a hunting horn. Martha and Benjamin ran harder, their lungs burning in the cold air. They dodged between buildings, through vacant lots, past startled chickens and barking dogs. Martha's dress caught on a fence post and tore, but she kept running. They reached the edge of town just as the sun touched the western horizon. The Kansas prairie stretched before them like an ocean of grass, vast and empty and offering no place to hide. But staying in Lawrence meant capture, and capture meant losing Benjamin forever. This way, Martha panted, leading her son toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked a distant creek. They stumbled through the tall grass as darkness fell around them like a blanket. Behind them, Martha could hear horses and see the glow of torches as Joshua organized a search party. Her side ached with a sharp stitch, and Benjamin was breathing hard, but they couldn't stop. Not yet. The creek offered temporary shelter among the trees, but Martha knew they couldn't hide there long. Joshua would search every hiding place within 10 miles of Lawrence. They needed to get farther away, deeper into the wild country where no sheriff would follow. I'm scared, Mama, Benjamin whispered as they huddled together in the darkness. I know, baby. I'm scared too. Martha pulled him closer, feeling how thin he had become, how small and fragile in her arms. But we're together, and that's what matters. Are we gonna die out here? The question hung between them like a physical thing. Martha thought of the approaching winter, their lack of food and shelter, the stories about Indian raids and prairie wolves. She thought of Joshua's relentless pursuit and the lie about stolen money that could put her in prison. No, she said firmly, surprised by the strength in her own voice. We're going to survive. We're going to find a place where nobody can hurt us. Benjamin nodded against her shoulder, trusting her with the complete faith that only children possess. Martha stared up at the stars appearing in the clear Kansas sky and tried to believe her own words. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. The sound raised the hair on Martha's arms and made Benjamin press closer against her side. But for the first time since leaving the hotel, Martha felt something besides fear. She felt determination. Tomorrow they would head south, away from the settled country where Joshua's lies could follow them. South into the wild territories where only the strong survived, but where a woman and her son might disappear completely into the vastness of the frontier. It was dangerous. It was probably foolish, but it was their only chance. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching weather. Martha wrapped Robert's coat around Benjamin's sleeping form and settled in to wait for dawn. In a few hours, they would begin the most dangerous journey of their lives. But tonight they were still free. The scream that split the pre-dawn darkness wasn't human. It was the sound of death itself, long and wild and hungry. Martha jerked awake beside the dying embers of their tiny fire, her heart hammering against her ribs as the cry echoed across the empty prairie. Wolves! Benjamin stirred in her arms, his thin body shivering despite Robert's heavy coat wrapped around him. They had been traveling south for 6 days since fleeing Lawrence, sleeping rough and eating whatever Martha could forage from the increasingly barren landscape. The boy's face looked gaunt in the faint starlight, his cheeks hollow with hunger that gnawed at Martha's soul. "Mama," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What was that?" "Just the wind, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But Martha's eyes scanned the darkness surrounding their meager camp. They had stopped for the night in a shallow depression between low hills, hoping the slight shelter might hide their fire from any searching eyes. Now that same depression felt like a trap, with high ground on all sides where predators could approach unseen. The wolf howled again, closer this time. Then another answered from a different direction, and another. Martha's mouth went dry as she realized the truth. They were being circled. She had heard the stories around campfires and in general stores. Prairie wolves were different from their forest cousins, bigger and more aggressive. They hunted in packs, and they weren't afraid of humans, especially humans who looked weak and vulnerable. Moving slowly so as not to wake Benjamin, Martha reached for the small skinning knife she had traded for in the last settlement they'd passed through. The blade was only 4 inches long, useful for preparing rabbits but pitiful against a pack of hungry wolves. A shadow moved on the ridge above them, and Martha's breath caught in her throat. The wolf was massive, easily as large as a small pony, its yellow eyes reflecting the last glow of their fire. It stood perfectly still, studying them with the patience of a natural killer. More shadows appeared along the ridgeline. Martha counted at least 6 wolves, probably more hidden in the darkness. They had found the scent of easy prey, a woman and child with no weapons, no horse and nowhere to run. "Benjamin," Martha whispered urgently. "Wake up, but don't move fast." The boy's eyes opened, instantly alert with the wariness that had become second nature during their weeks of hardship. He saw the knife in Martha's hand and the terror in her eyes, and his own gaze darted to the shadows gathering around them. "Wolves," Martha breathed. Benjamin's face went white, but he didn't cry out. Instead, he slowly reached for the heavy stick he had been using as a walking staff. At 10 years old, he had learned that crying and panic were luxuries they couldn't afford. The lead wolf took a step down the slope, then another. Its pack mates began to move as well, flowing down the hillsides like gray water. They made no sound now, their approach silent and coordinated with deadly efficiency. Martha stood slowly, pulling Benjamin up beside her. The fire had burned down to glowing coals that cast more shadows than light. In minutes, the wolves would be close enough to spring. "When I say run," Martha whispered, "head for that big rock over there. Get on top of it and stay there no matter what happens." "I won't leave you, Mama. You'll do what I tell you to keep yourself alive." Martha's voice carried an iron authority that brooked no argument. "Promise me." Benjamin nodded reluctantly, his small hands gripping the walking stick until his knuckles went white. The wolves were 30 yards away now, spreading out to cut off all escape routes. Martha could hear their breathing, see the steam rising from their open mouths in the cold air. The lead wolf was enormous, with scars across its muzzle that spoke of many battles won. 20 yards. Martha grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it over her head, shouting at the top of her lungs. "Get back! Get away from us!" The wolves paused but didn't retreat. Fire was a weapon they respected but didn't fear, especially when wielded by someone so obviously desperate. 10 yards. "Run!" Martha screamed. Benjamin sprinted toward the large boulder, his thin legs carrying him faster than Martha would have thought possible. She followed, swinging the burning stick in wide arcs to keep the wolves at bay. But she could feel them closing in, hear their paws hitting the ground as they charged. A massive gray shape launched itself at Martha's back. She spun and thrust the burning stick forward, catching the wolf in the face with a shower of sparks. The animal yelped and fell back, but 2 more were already flanking her from both sides. Benjamin reached the boulder and scrambled up its rough surface like a squirrel. "Mama! Hurry!" Martha ran the last 10 yards with wolves snapping at her heels. She threw herself against the rock face and began climbing, her fingernails scraping against stone as she hauled herself upward. Teeth snapped shut inches from her ankle. She collapsed beside Benjamin on top of the boulder, both of them gasping for breath. The wolves circled below them, their yellow eyes gleaming with frustrated hunger. The rock was tall enough to keep them safe for now, but Martha knew it was only a temporary refuge. "What do we do now?" Benjamin asked, his voice shaking. Martha looked around desperately. The boulder was an island in a sea of grass, offering no escape route. The wolves showed no signs of leaving, settling down to wait with the patience of creatures who had learned that hunger always won in the end. Dawn was still hours away, and even then, the wolves might not give up. Martha had heard stories of packs that waited for days until their prey grew weak enough to fall. "We wait," she said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe they'll get bored and leave." But even as she spoke, Martha could see the intelligence in the lead wolf's scarred face. This was an old hunter who had learned that patience brought rewards. He wasn't going anywhere. The temperature was dropping as the night wore on, and Martha could feel Benjamin shivering against her side. They had left their blankets by the fire when they ran, and the cold was becoming as dangerous as the wolves below. "Tell me about Papa again," Benjamin whispered, his teeth chattering. Martha wrapped her arms around her son, sharing what little warmth they had. "What do you want to know?" "Tell me about the time he fought off those cattle thieves." The story was one of Benjamin's favorites, though Martha had sanitized it over the years to remove the worst details. Robert had been outnumbered 3-1 when rustlers tried to steal their livestock, but he had used clever tactics and raw determination to drive them off. "Your father was smart," Martha said, her voice carrying across the dark prairie. "He knew he couldn't outfight 3 men, so he had to outthink them." As she spoke, an idea began forming in Martha's mind. She studied the wolves below, noting how they positioned themselves around the rock. They were confident in their advantage, certain that time was on their side. Maybe she could use that confidence against them. "Benjamin," she said quietly, "how far can you throw a rock?" The boy looked puzzled. "Pretty far, I guess." "Why?" Martha pointed to a spot about 50 yards away where another large boulder cast deep shadows in the moonlight. "Do you think you could hit that rock from here?" Benjamin squinted at the target, his young eyes sharper than Martha's in the darkness. "Maybe, if I threw real hard." "Here's what we're going to do." For the next hour, Martha and Benjamin gathered every loose stone they could find on top of their refuge. Some were small as marbles, others large as apples. When they had collected 24 rocks, Martha began explaining her plan. The wolves had grown restless as the night wore on, but they remained in position around the boulder. The lead wolf lay with his head on his paws, watching them with unblinking yellow eyes. "Remember," Martha whispered, "we only get one chance at this." Benjamin nodded, his face set with determination that reminded Martha painfully of his father. The boy selected his largest rock and took careful aim at the distant boulder. The stone sailed through the darkness and struck the target with a sharp crack that echoed across the prairie. Immediately, Martha began throwing her own rocks in the same direction, creating a cascade of noise that sounded like horses approaching at a gallop. The wolves' heads snapped up, their ears pricked toward the sound. For a moment, they remained motionless, trying to identify the source of the commotion. Then the lead wolf stood and barked once, a sharp command that sent the entire pack racing toward the distant sounds. They thought other prey was approaching, possibly easier targets than the humans on the rock. "Now!" Martha hissed. She and Benjamin scrambled down the boulder on the side opposite from where the wolves had gone. They hit the ground running, sprinting across the open prairie toward a line of trees that marked another creek. Behind them, angry howls erupted as the wolves discovered the deception. But Martha and Benjamin had a head start, and fear gave wings to their feet. They crashed through the undergrowth along the creek bank, splashing across shallow water and stumbling over fallen logs. The wolves were coming, their howls growing closer, but the trees offered hiding places that the open prairie had denied. Martha pulled Benjamin into a dense thicket of brambles, ignoring the thorns that tore at their clothes and skin. They lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as the wolf pack swept past their hiding place. For long minutes, they could hear the animals searching through the trees, their frustrated whines and barks echoing in the darkness. But gradually, the sounds faded as the pack moved on to easier hunting grounds. Dawn found Martha and Benjamin still huddled in the thicket, cold and exhausted but alive. As the sun painted the sky pink and gold, Martha felt a surge of fierce pride in what they had accomplished. They had faced death together and emerged victorious through quick thinking and courage. Whatever other challenges lay ahead, she knew they could handle them. The wilderness was teaching them to be stronger than they had ever imagined possible. The arrow whistled past Martha's ear so close she felt the feathers brush her skin, and she knew with terrible certainty that their luck had finally run out. She grabbed Benjamin's hand and dove behind a fallen cottonwood tree just as two more arrows thudded into the bark where they had been standing. "Stay down!" she hissed, pressing her son's face against the muddy ground beside the creek where they had been drinking. Through the gaps in the dead branches, she could see 3 Comanche warriors on horseback emerging from the tall grass like ghosts made flesh. They had been traveling south for 2 weeks since escaping the wolves, surviving on wild berries, prairie grass seeds, and the occasional rabbit Benjamin managed to catch with snares he had learned to make from necessity. Martha's dress hung in tatters, and Benjamin's ribs showed through his torn shirt like fence slats. They were starving, exhausted, and completely defenseless against mounted warriors who could ride down a running deer. "Mama, I'm scared," Benjamin whispered, his small body trembling against hers. "I know, baby. Just stay quiet and maybe they'll pass by." But even as she spoke, Martha could hear the soft thud of hooves on grass growing closer. The warriors weren't passing by. They were hunting. One of the Comanche called out something in his own language, his voice carrying authority and confidence. Another answered from a different direction, and Martha realized with growing horror that they were being surrounded again. First wolves, now this. The prairie seemed determined to test every ounce of strength they possessed. Hoofbeats approached their hiding place from the left. Martha risked a quick look over the log and saw a young warrior, barely older than a boy himself, guiding his spotted pony toward their position. He carried a bow with an arrow already notched, and his dark eyes scanned the ground for tracks. Martha's heart hammered so hard she was certain the warrior would hear it. She and Benjamin had left clear footprints in the mud beside the creek, tracks that led straight to their hiding place like arrows pointing the way. The young warrior's pony snorted and shied sideways, sensing something wrong. The rider spoke softly to calm his mount, then swung down from the saddle and began examining the ground more carefully. Martha closed her eyes and tried to think. They couldn't run, the warriors on horseback would catch them in seconds. They couldn't fight. She had only the small knife and Benjamin was just a child. All they could do was hope that somehow, miraculously, the warriors would decide they weren't worth the trouble. A shadow fell across their hiding place. Martha opened her eyes to see the young warrior standing directly above them, his bow drawn and aimed at her head. His face was painted with red and yellow stripes, and his black hair was decorated with feathers and bone ornaments that clicked softly in the breeze. "Get up," he said in careful English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Martha rose slowly, keeping her hands visible and pulling Benjamin up beside her. The boy's face was white with terror, but he stood straight and didn't cry. Martha felt a surge of pride in his courage even as her own knees shook with fear. The other two warriors rode closer, their ponies dancing nervously at the scent of fear. One was older, with gray streaking his long braids and scars across his chest that spoke of many battles. The third was younger than the first, with a cruel smile that made Martha's skin crawl. The older warrior spoke rapidly in Comanche, gesturing toward Martha and Benjamin. The young one who had found them replied, and Martha caught the word woman mixed in with the foreign syllables. "Please," Martha said, her voice barely steady. "We're not here to cause trouble. We're just trying to survive." The older warrior studied her with intelligent eyes. When he spoke, his English was better than the young one's, though still heavily accented. "You are far from your people, white woman. This is Comanche land now. We didn't know. We're lost." The cruel-faced warrior laughed and said something that made the others grin. Martha didn't need to understand the language to know he was making suggestions about what to do with them. "My son is just a child," Martha said desperately. "If you're going to kill us, please make it quick." The older warrior raised an eyebrow. "Kill you? Who spoke of killing?" Martha blinked in confusion. Every story she had ever heard about Comanche raids involved scalping and burning and death. But these warriors seemed more curious than bloodthirsty. "You have been traveling long," the older warrior observed, taking in their ragged appearance and hollow cheeks. "When did you last eat meat?" What? Meat? Fresh meat? Not the grass and roots you have been eating." Martha's stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, answering the question without words. The warrior nodded as if confirming something he already knew. "You will come with us," he announced. "Where?" Martha asked, though she knew they had no choice in the matter. "To see someone who will decide what becomes of you." The warriors helped Martha and Benjamin onto the back of the older man's pony. The animal was strong enough to carry all three of them, though Martha had never ridden bareback before and had to grip the warrior's leather vest to keep from falling off. They rode south across rolling hills covered in buffalo grass and scattered wildflowers. The landscape was more rugged here, cut by deep ravines and dotted with strange rock formations that looked like sleeping giants. Martha had never seen country like this. It was both beautiful and threatening, like a pretty woman with a knife hidden behind her back. As they traveled, Martha noticed things that didn't match the savage stories she had heard. The warriors' equipment was well-made and carefully maintained. Their horses were healthy and well-trained. They spoke quietly among themselves, pointing out landmarks and discussing what appeared to be hunting strategy. These weren't mindless killers. They were skilled professionals who knew their business. After an hour of riding, they topped a ridge and Martha gasped at what lay below. A Comanche camp stretched along both sides of a clear-running river, with dozens of buffalo-hide teepees arranged in careful patterns. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the grass, and women worked at various tasks while dogs barked and ran between the lodges. It looked almost normal, like a town made of leather instead of wood. "This is your village?" Martha asked. "For now," the older warrior replied. "We follow the buffalo. They move, we move." As they rode down into the camp, Martha felt dozens of eyes watching their approach. Men, women, and children emerged from their teepees to stare at the white woman and boy being brought in by the hunting party. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, but Martha was surprised to see no outright hostility. They stopped in front of a large teepee decorated with painted symbols Martha couldn't read. The older warrior dismounted and helped Martha and Benjamin down from the horse. "Wait here," he commanded, then disappeared inside the lodge. Martha and Benjamin stood surrounded by curious Comanche, feeling like exotic animals on display. A group of children approached cautiously, whispering among themselves and giggling at Benjamin's pale skin and strange clothes. One little girl, about Benjamin's age, stepped forward and offered him a piece of dried meat. Benjamin looked to Martha for permission, then accepted the gift with a shy smile. "Thank you," he said softly. The girl giggled again and ran back to her friends, who erupted in excited chatter. They seem nice, Benjamin whispered to Martha. Don't let your guard down, Martha replied, though she was beginning to wonder if every story she had ever heard about the Comanche was wrong. The older warrior emerged from the teepee and beckoned them forward. The chief will see you now. Martha and Benjamin ducked through the entrance flap and found themselves in a surprisingly spacious interior. Buffalo robes covered the ground, and weapons and tools hung from the wooden poles that supported the structure. In the center, a small fire burned in a carefully constructed pit, its smoke rising through an opening at the top of the teepee. Across the fire sat a man who radiated authority like heat from the flames. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver threading his black braids and a face marked by intelligence and hard experience. His clothes were finer than the warriors who had brought them, decorated with beadwork and quills in intricate patterns. But what struck Martha most was his eyes. They were kind eyes, filled with wisdom and understanding that reminded her of her own father. "Sit," the chief said in perfect English, gesturing to robes spread beside the fire. Martha and Benjamin sat carefully, unsure of the protocol. The chief studied them for a long moment, then spoke to the older warrior in Comanche. The warrior replied at length, apparently giving a full report of how they had been found. "I am called Tosapovi by my people," the chief said finally. "In your language it means white knife. You may use that name. I'm Martha Whitmore. This is my son Benjamin." "You are far from home, Martha Whitmore." "We don't have a home anymore." White Knife nodded as if this explained much. "And you travel alone through dangerous country because—" Martha hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But something in the chief's manner encouraged honesty. "My husband died. His family threw us out. We've been trying to survive on our own." His family did not honor their obligation to care for his widow and child? No, they didn't. White Knife's expression darkened. "This is not the way of honorable people. A man's family should protect his woman and children, not cast them out like unwanted dogs." The unexpected sympathy in his voice brought tears to Martha's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown them kindness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. "You are hungry," White Knife observed. "When did you last eat a full meal?" Martha tried to remember. "Days ago. Maybe a week." The chief called out in Comanche, and shortly afterward, a woman entered carrying bowls of stew that smelled like heaven. Martha and Benjamin fell on the food with desperate hunger, barely remembering their manners. White Knife watched them eat with satisfied approval. "Food is sacred," he said. "No one should go hungry when there is enough to share." As their immediate hunger subsided, Martha began to relax slightly. These people had shown them more kindness in 1 hour than Joshua and Eleanor had in 8 months. "What happens to us now?" she asked. White Knife considered the question carefully. "That depends on you, Martha Whitmore. What do you want to happen?" The question caught her off guard. For weeks, she had been focused solely on survival, on making it through each day without dying. She hadn't dared to think about what kind of future they might have. "I want my son to be safe," she said finally. "I want him to grow up strong and free." "And for yourself?" Martha looked down at her hands, seeing the calluses and scars that marked her transformation from helpless widow to frontier survivor. "I want to be strong enough to protect him." White Knife smiled for the first time since they had met. "These are good wishes. Perhaps they can be granted." Before Martha could ask what he meant, a commotion outside the teepee drew everyone's attention. Voices were raised in excitement, and she could hear horses approaching at a gallop. "The hunters return," White Knife said, rising to his feet. "Come, you should see this." They emerged from the teepee to find the entire camp gathering around a group of returning warriors. Leading them was a man mounted on a magnificent black stallion, his long hair streaming behind him as he guided his horse with casual expertise. Even from a distance, Martha could see that this warrior was different from the others. Taller, stronger, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his own skin. He carried himself with quiet confidence that spoke of respect earned through deed rather than birth. As he drew closer, Martha caught her breath. The warrior's eyes found hers across the crowd, and she felt something electric pass between them like lightning jumping from cloud to cloud. She didn't know his name yet, but somehow she knew that this man would change everything. Nailnish had been tracking the wounded elk for 3 days when he first caught sight of the white woman and her son. But it wasn't the elk that made him rein in his horse and study the scene below with growing interest. It was the way the woman moved, not with the clumsy desperation of most white settlers, but with the careful, economical motions of someone who had learned to survive by watching and adapting. From his position on the ridge above their meager camp, the Comanche hunter could read their story in a dozen small details. The boys' clothes were well mended despite their wear, showing a mother who took pride in caring for her child even in desperate circumstances. Their fire was built efficiently in a shallow depression that would hide most of the light. Someone had taught them basic survival skills, or they had learned them through hard necessity. But it was the woman's posture that intrigued him most. She sat with her back straight and her head up, scanning the horizon with alert intelligence. This wasn't a broken victim fleeing blindly into the wilderness. This was someone who had chosen their path deliberately and was determined to see it through. The elk trail had led him far from his band's winter camp, following the great herds as they moved toward the protected valleys where they would weather the coming storms. At 28 winters, Nailnish had earned his place among the most skilled hunters of his people. But success in the hunt meant little when his heart remained empty. 2 summers ago, cavalry soldiers had attacked a peaceful village near the Canadian River, killing his wife and infant daughter along with dozens of other innocents. Since then, he had thrown himself into hunting and fighting with reckless intensity, earning respect for his skills while his soul grew colder with each passing season. His mother, one of the few people who dared speak truth to him anymore, had warned him that a man who lived only for revenge would eventually forget how to live for anything else. "You honor the dead by creating new life," she had told him, "not by joining them before your time." But watching the white woman protect her son with fierce determination, Nailnish felt something stir inside him that he had thought dead forever. The sight of such courage in the face of impossible odds reminded him of his own mother during the hungry years after his father's death in battle, when survival had depended more on will than strength. The decision to approach their camp formed slowly, like ice crystallizing on still water. These two were clearly starving and completely unprepared for winter on the southern plains. Within days, maybe hours, the cold would claim them both. Yet something in their bearing suggested they deserved better than such a meaningless death. As he guided his horse down the slope toward their camp, Nailnish found himself remembering his grandmother's stories about the old days, when Comanche bands sometimes adopted worthy captives who proved their courage and wisdom. The practice had become rare as warfare with the whites intensified, but the traditions remained. Perhaps it was time to honor those traditions again. The woman spotted his approach while he was still 50 yards away, immediately placing herself between him and the boy in a protective stance that earned his respect. She had no weapons that could threaten a mounted warrior, but her body language declared clearly that she would fight to the death rather than surrender her child. When he dismounted and began building up their dying fire with practiced efficiency, he could feel her confusion mixing with desperate hope. The smell of hunger hung around them like a visible thing, and the boy's hollow cheeks spoke of too many meals sacrificed so his mother could eat. "You are hungry," Nailnish said in the careful English he had learned from traders and captives. The words felt strange in his mouth after so many months of speaking only Comanche, but he persevered. "Winter comes soon. This fire will die without proper wood." The woman's response revealed more about her character than any lengthy speech could have. Instead of demanding explanations or begging for mercy, she simply asked why he would help them. It was a practical question that showed she understood the world operated on exchanges of value rather than random charity. As they shared the elk meat he had brought and talked in the mixture of words and gestures that bridged their different languages, Nailnish found himself studying Martha Whitmore with growing appreciation. She was intelligent enough to recognize the danger of their situation without becoming paralyzed by fear. She asked thoughtful questions about survival techniques and listened carefully to his answers, filing away information that might keep them alive another day. The boy, Benjamin, possessed his mother's quick intelligence along with a resilience that impressed Nailnish greatly. Despite his youth and obvious hunger, he watched everything with sharp attention and showed no signs of the whining or complaining that Nailnish had observed in other white children. When Martha asked what he wanted in return for his help, Nailnish found himself sharing thoughts he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. The old ways of his people were changing faster than the seasons, pressed between the advancing white settlements and the U.S. Army's relentless campaigns. Perhaps survival required learning new approaches, finding strength through adaptation rather than pure resistance. The hidden valley where Nailnish had decided to take them lay 2 days' ride to the southeast, a place known only to the most experienced hunters where spring water ran year-round and cottonwoods provided shelter from prairie storms. It would offer them protection through the worst of winter while he taught them the skills they would need to survive in this harsh country. But as they prepared to leave the exposed campsite where he had found them, Nailnish sensed that the woman understood this was about more than simple survival lessons. The way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, the careful attention she paid to his words, the growing trust in her eyes, all of it spoke to possibilities that neither of them had dared to name yet. The ride to the valley tested both Martha and Benjamin's endurance, but they bore the hardships without complaint. Martha proved to be a natural rider despite her lack of experience, adapting quickly to the rhythm of his horse's gait. Benjamin rode behind her with the serious concentration of a child who understood that staying mounted might mean the difference between life and death. As they traveled deeper into Comanche territory, passing landmarks that held sacred meaning for his people, Nailnish found himself sharing stories and explanations that he had never offered to white captives before. Something about Martha's genuine interest and respectful questions encouraged him to speak of things usually kept within the tribe. When they finally reached the hidden valley, Martha's reaction confirmed Nailnish's growing certainty that he had made the right choice. Instead of expressing relief at reaching shelter, she immediately began assessing the site with practical eyes, noting the defensible positions, the water source, and the available materials for building proper shelter. "This place is beautiful," she said, but her tone suggested she was thinking beyond mere aesthetics to the strategic advantages the location offered. "It has protected my people for many generations," Nailnish replied. "Now it will protect you." The lessons that began the next morning covered more ground than mere survival techniques. As Nailnish taught Martha to read weather signs in cloud formations and wind patterns, he found himself explaining the spiritual connections his people saw between all living things. When he showed Benjamin how to move silently through tall grass, the instruction included lessons about patience and respect for the prey that would sustain them. Martha absorbed everything with startling speed, her hands learning to work buffalo hide with growing skill, while her mind grasped the subtle logic behind techniques that had taken Nailnish years to master. She asked intelligent questions that showed she was thinking several steps ahead, already planning how to apply new knowledge to future challenges. Benjamin proved even more adaptable, his young mind soaking up skills and concepts with the effortless ease of childhood. Within days, he was tracking small animals with reasonable success and making fires under conditions that would have defeated many adult warriors. But it was during the long evening hours around their shared fire that the deeper connections began forming between them. Martha spoke of her husband with love, but without the desperate clinging to the past that Nailnish had expected. She shared memories that revealed Robert Whitmore to have been a good man who had valued his family above personal ambition, qualities that earned respect even from someone who had never met him. In return, Nailnish found himself talking about his lost wife and daughter with less pain than he had felt in 2 years. Martha listened without offering empty consolations or trying to minimize his grief, simply accepting his words with the understanding of someone who had faced her own losses. As winter deepened around their valley refuge, the barriers between their different worlds began dissolving like morning frost under warming sun. Language barriers faded as they developed their own mixture of English, Comanche, and hand signals. Cultural differences became opportunities for learning rather than sources of conflict. Martha discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed, not just physical capabilities but confidence in her own judgment and worth. The frightened widow who had fled Joshua Whitmore's farm no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who could field dress a deer, predict weather changes, and hold her own in discussions of strategy and planning. Benjamin's transformation was even more dramatic. The thin, frightened boy grew stronger and more confident with each passing day, his natural intelligence sharpened by constant challenges that demanded quick thinking and decisive action. Under Nailnish's patient guidance, he began developing the skills and mindset of a warrior while retaining the compassion and curiosity that would serve him well in any world. Yet beneath their growing partnership lay unspoken tensions that grew stronger as the season progressed. Martha caught herself watching Nailnish work with an appreciation that went far beyond gratitude for his protection. The way he moved, the quiet authority in his voice, the gentleness he showed when teaching Benjamin, all of it awakened feelings she had thought buried with her husband. Nailnish struggled with his own growing attachment to the white woman who had proven herself worthy of respect in every way that mattered to his people. The sound of her laughter, the proud way she carried herself after mastering a new skill, the fierce protectiveness she showed toward Benjamin, everything about her reminded him that his heart was not as dead as he had believed. The first real test of their new relationship came on a bitter February morning, when Benjamin developed a fever that threatened to become something far more serious. For 3 days, Martha nursed her son with desperate intensity, while Nailnish rode through blizzard conditions to gather medicinal plants from distant valleys. During the long nights when Benjamin's fever raged highest, Martha and Nailnish took turns cooling his burning skin and forcing healing teas between his cracked lips. They worked together with the seamless coordination of people who trusted each other completely, each anticipating the other's needs without spoken communication. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Benjamin opened clear eyes to find his mother collapsed across his chest from exhaustion and Nailnish maintaining vigilant watch beside their bed. The moment marked a turning point that none of them could ignore any longer. "You saved his life," Martha whispered to Nailnish later that day as Benjamin slept peacefully for the first time in nearly a week. "We saved his life," Nailnish corrected gently. "A child needs both strength and love to survive such sickness." The words hung between them loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But as spring began showing the first tentative signs of its approach, they all understood that decisions would soon need to be made about what kind of future they wanted to build together. The winter that had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had become something none of them had expected, a time of healing, growth, and the gradual recognition that families could be formed by choice rather than blood alone. But spring would bring new challenges that would test everything they had learned about trust, courage, and the true meaning of belonging to each other. The gunshot cracked across the spring morning like breaking thunder, and Martha's world exploded into chaos as Joshua Whitmore's voice roared from across the creek. "Found you at last, you thieving witch!" She spun around from where she had been gathering wild onions, her heart slamming against her ribs as she saw 3 mounted men emerging from the cottonwood trees. Joshua sat his horse like a conquering general, his massive frame draped in a new coat that spoke of money spent on this hunting expedition. Beside him rode 2 hard-faced strangers with guns already drawn, their eyes scanning the valley with professional wariness. "Benjamin!" Martha screamed, dropping her gathering basket as she ran toward their shelter. "Nailnish!" But even as she called their names, Martha could see that Joshua had planned this moment carefully. He must have been watching for hours, waiting until Nailnish left on his morning hunt and Benjamin wandered down to the creek to check his fishing lines. Now her son was trapped on the far side of the water with no way to reach safety, and Nailnish was nowhere in sight. "Don't you move another step, boy!" Joshua bellowed at Benjamin, who had frozen knee-deep in the creek water. "You belong to Whitmore blood, and you're coming home where you can be raised proper." Benjamin's young face went white with terror, but Martha felt fierce pride as she watched him stand straighter instead of cowering. The winter with Nailnish had changed her son from a frightened child into someone who faced danger with courage. "I don't want to go with you," Benjamin called back, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I choose to stay with my mama." Joshua's face darkened with rage. "You don't get to choose, boy. Eleanor's been worried sick about you, wondering if the savages had scalped you yet." His cruel grin showed tobacco-stained teeth. "Though maybe that would have been a mercy, considering what your mother's become." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She knew what Joshua saw when he looked at her now. a woman transformed by months of frontier living into something he couldn't understand or control. Her hair hung in a long braid decorated with small feathers and beads. Her dress was buckskin, carefully tanned and decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken her weeks to complete. She moved with the confident grace of someone who knew her own strength. She was no longer the broken widow who had fled his cruelty 8 months ago. "You're trespassing on Comanche land," Martha said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Turn around and leave before someone gets hurt." One of Joshua's hired men laughed harshly. "Comanche land? Lady, the army's been clearing out Indian nests from here to the Arkansas River. Your savage friends are either dead or running for Mexico by now." The words sent ice through Martha's veins. If the army was conducting sweeps through this territory, Nailnish could be riding into an ambush at this very moment. The thought of losing him made her stomach clench with fear that had nothing to do with her own safety. "Besides," Joshua added with satisfaction, "I brought along some insurance this time." He gestured to one of his companions, a thin man with cold eyes who wore a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. "Deputy Marshal Crawford here has a warrant for your arrest. Seems you stole $50 from your loving family before you ran off." Martha's mouth went dry. A federal warrant meant Joshua could drag her back to Kansas in chains, and once she was in jail, he would have complete control over Benjamin's future. "I never stole anything," she said. "Tell that to the judge," Crawford replied, urging his horse closer to the creek. "Now come along peaceful, and nobody needs to get hurt." "What about my son?" "The boy comes with us," Joshua declared. "Eleanor's got big plans for his education. Gonna send him back east to a proper school where he can learn civilized ways." Benjamin took a step backward in the water, his eyes wide with panic. "I won't go. You can't make me." "Watch me," Joshua snarled, spurring his horse into the creek. That's when the first arrow appeared in Crawford's shoulder. The deputy screamed and tumbled from his saddle, splashing into the shallow water as his horse reared in terror. Joshua's other companion spun around, looking wildly for the source of the attack, just as Nailnish emerged from the tall grass like a avenging spirit. The Comanche warrior had approached unseen, using skills learned in 100 raids to get within striking distance before revealing himself. Now he stood 30 yards away, another arrow already notched and drawn, his dark eyes promising death to anyone who threatened his adopted family. "Let the woman and boy go," Nailnish called in clear English, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Ride away now, and you might live to see sunset." Joshua's remaining gunman swung his rifle toward Nailnish, but the arrow took him in the chest before he could fire. He toppled backward off his horse with a strangled cry, his weapon splashing uselessly into the creek. Now only Joshua remained, his face twisted with rage and fear as he found himself facing a Comanche warrior with nothing but a handgun he was too scared to draw. "You," he spat, recognizing Nailnish from Martha's transformed appearance. "You're the savage that stole my brother's wife." "I am the man who saved her from your cruelty," Nailnish replied calmly, moving closer with deadly purpose. "The man who gave her son the protection you denied him." Martha watched the confrontation with her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen Nailnish hunt and fight during their months together, had witnessed his deadly skill with bow and knife. But this was different. This was personal, and she could see the cold fury burning in his dark eyes. Joshua finally found the courage to draw his pistol, but his hands shook so badly he could barely hold it steady. "Stay back. I'll shoot you down like the animal you are." "You are the animal here," Nailnish said, still advancing. "A man who beats children and drives away his own blood." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Martha realized that Nailnish wasn't just defending them from immediate danger. He was delivering judgment on Joshua's character and finding it completely worthless. "The boy belongs with his family," Joshua shouted, desperation making his voice crack. "His family is here," Nailnish replied simply, "with people who love him instead of using him." Benjamin chose that moment to splash out of the creek and run to Martha's side, wrapping his thin arms around her waist. The gesture was small but definitive, a child choosing his mother over the man who claimed ownership of his blood. Joshua's gun wavered as he saw his prize slipping away. "You can't do this. There are laws. That woman is wanted for theft." "White man's laws have no power here," Nailnish said, his bow still drawn and ready. "This is Comanche land, and we protect our own." The standoff stretched taut as rope, with Joshua's pistol trained on Nailnish and the warrior's arrow aimed at Joshua's heart. Martha could see the calculation happening behind Joshua's eyes, the desperate weighing of options by a man who had finally encountered someone he couldn't bully or intimidate. Crawford groaned from where he lay in the creek, clutching his wounded shoulder. The other gunman wasn't moving at all. Joshua was alone, outmatched, and completely out of his element in country that belonged to his enemies. "This isn't over," he said finally, backing his horse toward the creek bank. "I'll bring the army back here. I'll hunt you down if it takes the rest of my life." "Then you will die hunting," Nailnish replied with quiet certainty. Joshua holstered his gun and grabbed Crawford's horse, hauling the wounded deputy across the saddle like a sack of grain. His eyes found Martha one last time, filled with hatred and frustrated rage. "You've chosen your path, woman. Don't come crying to me when your savage turns on you." He spurred both horses toward the opposite bank, leaving his dead companion floating face down in the peaceful creek water. Martha watched him disappear into the trees, knowing she would never see Joshua Whitmore again, but understanding that his threats weren't empty bluster. There would be consequences for this day's work. The army would come looking eventually, asking questions about missing white men and the Indians who had killed them. Their sanctuary in the hidden valley was finished. "We have to leave tonight," Nailnish said as he pulled the dead gunman from the creek, his voice heavy with certainty that cut through Martha's heart like a blade. "By tomorrow, more will come looking for these men." Martha nodded, though every fiber of her being rebelled against abandoning the place that had become their home. The hidden valley had sheltered them through the harsh winter months, had given them space to heal and grow and discover what they meant to each other. Now spring flowers bloomed along the creek banks where blood was already washing away downstream, and she would never see this peaceful sanctuary again. "Where will we go?" Benjamin asked, his young voice steady despite the fear Martha could see in his dark eyes. Nailnish finished dragging the body onto dry ground and began stripping it of anything useful: ammunition, a decent knife, coins from the dead man's pockets. The practical necessities of survival left no room for squeamishness about robbing the dead. "North," he said simply, "to my mother's people along the Platte River. They move with the great buffalo herds where the army cannot follow easily." Martha felt her stomach clench at the thought of joining a full Comanche band. Living with Nailnish in isolation was one thing, but becoming part of his tribe meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. White society would consider her lost forever, a woman who had abandoned civilization to live as a savage. But what choice did they have? Joshua's threats weren't empty bluster. He would return with soldiers and federal marshals, armed with warrants and the full authority of the United States government. The charges of theft alone could put her in prison for years, leaving Benjamin at the mercy of his uncle's cruelty. "Will they accept us?" she asked quietly. Nailnish looked up from his grim work, his dark eyes soft with understanding. "You have proven your worth through the winter. My mother will welcome the woman who helped save her son from the darkness that was consuming him." The admission surprised Martha. She had known that their growing relationship was healing something broken inside Nailnish, but he had never spoken so directly about his emotional wounds. "What about Benjamin? The boy has the heart of a warrior and the mind of a leader. He will find his place among my people as easily as he found it here." Benjamin straightened at the words, pride evident in his young face. The months with Nailnish had changed him profoundly, teaching him skills and confidence that no white school could have provided. He could track game through difficult terrain, make fire under impossible conditions, and move through the wilderness with the silent grace of a born hunter. "I want to go," Benjamin said firmly. "I want to learn more about being strong." Martha looked at her son, truly looked at him, and realized with a shock that he was no longer the frightened child she had protected so fiercely. The boy standing before her had made his own choice about where he belonged, and his decision had nothing to do with fear or necessity. He wanted to stay with Nailnish. He wanted to become part of the Comanche world that had shown him respect and purpose. Martha, Nailnish's voice drew her attention back to him. This choice must be yours alone. I will not ask you to abandon your people for mine. But even as he spoke, Martha could see the hope and longing in his eyes. The careful distance he had maintained throughout the winter was cracking, revealing feelings he had kept hidden out of respect for her grieving and uncertainty. My people threw me away, Martha said, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. They called me worthless, treated my son like property to be claimed or discarded. Why should I feel loyalty to a world that showed me none? She walked to the edge of their camp, looking out over the valley that had been their refuge. In the distance, she could see the graves where they had buried the rabbits and deer that had sustained them, marked with small stones in the Comanche tradition of honoring the animals that gave their lives for human survival. Everything about this place spoke of a different way of living, one based on respect rather than domination, on earning worth through actions rather than inheriting it through bloodlines. The woman who had learned to tan hides and read weather signs bore little resemblance to the helpless widow who had fled Joshua's cruelty. I've already made my choice, Martha said, turning back to face Nailnish and Benjamin. I made it the first day you helped us. Everything since then has just been confirmation. Nailnish's face lit up with joy that transformed his usually serious expression. He crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her work-roughened skin. You are certain? Once we ride north with my people, there will be no returning to the white world. The white world never wanted me anyway, Martha replied. But your world gave me a chance to discover who I really am. They spent the next few hours erasing all traces of their presence in the valley. The teepee came down and was packed onto Nailnish's spare horses. Tools and weapons were secured for travel. The fire was scattered and covered until no sign remained of the hearth that had warmed them through the winter. As the sun reached its highest point, they mounted their horses and began the journey north toward a future that none of them could fully imagine. Martha rode beside Nailnish, her heart lighter than it had been since Robert's death. Benjamin rode slightly ahead, his young back straight with confidence and anticipation. Behind them, the hidden valley returned to the silence of wind and water, keeping its secrets safe until other refugees might need its shelter. The creek washed away the last traces of violence, and wildflowers bloomed where blood had fallen, transforming death into beauty through the eternal cycles of prairie life. As they climbed out of the valley and onto the rolling plains beyond, Martha caught sight of smoke on the distant horizon, Joshua returning with reinforcements, just as Nailnish had predicted. But the smoke was miles away and falling farther behind with each passing hour. No regrets? Nailnish asked, following her gaze toward the distant threat. Martha considered the question seriously. She was leaving behind everything she had known: her language, her customs, her identity as a white woman in a world dominated by white men. She was choosing a path that would make her an exile from her own people for the rest of her life. None, she said firmly. For the first time since Robert died, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of running away. Nailnish smiled and urged his horse into a faster pace. Then let us go forward together, all 3 of us, and see what kind of life we can build with our own hands. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, vast enough to hold all possibilities. Behind them lay the past with its pain and limitations. Ahead waited the Comanche nation, where worth was measured by courage rather than bloodlines, and where a woman who had proven her strength might find a place of honor. As they rode north toward their new destiny, Martha felt the last chains of her old life falling away like winter ice breaking up in spring floods. She was no longer Martha Whitmore, abandoned widow struggling to survive. She was becoming someone entirely new, a woman strong enough to choose her own family, brave enough to forge her own path, and wise enough to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms. The horizon called their names, and they answered with hearts full of hope and determination that could not be broken by any force on earth.